The restaurant, called the Gilded Nebula, sat on the highest level of Nexus Station, where only the wealthiest beings in the galaxy could afford to dine commander. Vorathkex walked through the golden doors with the confidence of someone who had conquered entire star systems, and he had earned that confidence through 200 years of warfare and political maneuvering that would make most species tremble in fear. His scales shimmered like molten bronze under the soft lighting, and each step he took caused the marble floor to vibrate slightly under his massive weight. The Draconari were an ancient race of dragon-like beings who had ruled their corner of the galaxy for thousands of years. Before humans had even learned to make fire, they stood nearly 3 meters tall, with thick scales that could deflect most weapons and claws that could tear through starship hulls. Vorathkex was considered small for his kind, but what he lacked in size he made up for in cunning and ruthlessness. Tonight was not about war, however. Tonight was about peace, or at least the appearance of peace. Ambassador Trulvex from the rival Scaled Dominion faction was already seated at the private table in the corner, and the two Draconari had been enemies for over 50 years. Their conflict had cost millions of lives across dozens of worlds, and the Kepler shipping lanes had become so dangerous that even the most desperate merchants refused to travel through them. The Galactic Council had finally intervened and demanded a ceasefire. Vorathkex did not trust Trulvex, and Trulvex certainly did not trust him, but both understood that continued war would eventually destroy them. Both the commander had chosen this restaurant specifically for its reputation for discretion and security. He had also made one very specific request to the management: no human staff. The young species had only been part of galactic society for about 80 years, and in that time they had earned a reputation that made Vorathkex uncomfortable. Humans were watchers. They noticed things that other species missed, and they had an unsettling habit of being exactly where they should not be at exactly the wrong time. Other species called them lucky, but Vorathkex knew better. Luck was just another word for paying attention when everyone else was distracted. The manager of the Gilded Nebula had assured him that all human employees would be assigned to other sections of the restaurant for the evening. This promise lasted exactly 45 minutes. Elena Vasquez walked through the kitchen doors carrying a bottle of Alderanian wine that cost more than most families earned in a year. She was a human woman who appeared to be in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in, a simple nod, and eyes that seemed too tired for someone her age. Her uniform was crisp and professional, and she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been serving tables for years. The truth was far more complicated. Elena had been working at the Gilded Nebula for 8 months, and in that time she had become invisible in the way that all good servers become invisible. The wealthy guests who dined here saw her as furniture, as background noise, as simply another part of the expensive decor. They never looked at her face, and they certainly never wondered about her past. This was exactly what Elena wanted. The manager had called her into his office 20 minutes ago. Looking stressed and apologetic, their senior server for the VIP section had called in sick, and the replacement was stuck in transit from another station. They needed someone experienced and discreet, and Elena was the best they had. She had agreed without hesitation. The manager had warned her about the Draconari guests and their specific requests, but Elena had simply nodded and collected her serving tray. She approached the corner table where Commander Vorathkex and Ambassador Trulvex were engaged in what appeared to be polite but tense conversation. Their massive forms dwarfed the elegant furniture, and their tails curled around the bases of their chairs like sleeping serpents. Elena bowed low in the Draconari fashion, showing respect to beings of superior rank. She had studied their customs carefully over the past months, just as she had studied the customs of every species that frequented this establishment. Knowledge was survival, and Elena had survived far too much to become careless. Now Commander Vorathkex barely glanced at her as she poured the wine into crystal glasses that had been specially designed to accommodate Draconari clauses. Attention remained fixed on Trilvex, who was speaking in low, rumbling tones about trade routes and territorial boundaries. Lena retreated to her position near the service station, where she could observe the entire dining room without appearing to watch anything at all. This was a skill she had developed long ago in a different life, when observation meant the difference between completing a mission and coming home in a body bag. She scanned the room with practiced ease, noting the positions of the security guards and the exits and the other diners who were trying very hard to pretend they were not watching the too powerful Draconari negotiate. Everything appeared normal, everything appeared safe, and yet something felt wrong. Elena could not identify the source of her unease, but she had learned long ago to trust her instincts. Those instincts had kept her alive through situations that should have killed her many times over. She continued her duties, bringing appetizers and refilling water glasses and clearing empty plates with mechanical precision, all the while her eyes kept sweeping the room, searching for whatever threat her subconscious had already detected. The first course came and went. The second course arrived with no incidents. By the time the third course was being prepared in the kitchen, Elena had almost convinced herself that she was being paranoid. Almost then, the new waiter arrived. He came through the staff entrance with a confident smile and credentials that checked out perfectly. His name was Marcus, and he claimed to be a transfer from the promenade location on the other side of the station. The manager was too busy to verify this claim personally, and the restaurant was understaffed, and the man seemed professional enough. He was assigned to assist Elena with the VIP section. Elena watched him cross the dining room toward her position, and in those few seconds, she noticed three things that most people would have missed entirely. First, his shoes were wrong. The Gilded Nebula issued soft-soled footwear to all servers because the marble floors amplified sound and wealthy guests expected silence. This man's shoes clicked faintly with each step, as if they had reinforced solace. Second, his left arm hung slightly stiff at his side, as if something beneath his jacket was restricting his natural movement. Third, when he positioned himself near the decorative pillar, he chose a spot that gave him a clear line of sight to Commander Vorathkek's neck ridge. The neck ridge was the one place where Draconari scales were thin enough for a weapon to penetrate. Elena kept her expression blank and her breathing steady. She had perhaps 3 minutes before this man made his move, and in those 3 minutes, she would have to find a way to warn a Draconari warlord who had specifically requested that no humans come anywhere near him. The universe certainly had a sense of humor. She had worked alongside them, and she had fought against them, and she had buried more than a few of them in unmarked graves on forgotten worlds. The way he held himself told her everything she needed to know. His shoulders were relaxed, but his core remained tight and ready for explosive movement. His eyes swept the room in patterns that appeared casual, but actually covered every exit and every potential threat. His breathing was slow and controlled, like someone who had trained themselves to remain calm in situations that would cause normal people to panic. This was a professional. This was someone who killed for money and who had probably been killing for a very long time. Elena moved through the dining room, collecting empty glasses and replacing napkins while her mind raced through possible solutions. The obvious choice was to alert security. The Gilded Nebula employed some of the best private security personnel in the sector, and they were equipped with weapons that could stop most threats. But security was positioned outside the main dining area as per diplomatic protocol. By the time they responded to an alarm, Marcus would have already fired his weapon and Commander Vorathkeks would be dead. She could try to stop him herself. Elena had skills that would surprise anyone who saw her as just a tired waitress in a fancy restaurant. But Marcus was armed, and she was not. And even if she managed to disarm him, there was a good chance that Ambassador Trilvex would use the chaos to complete the assassination himself. After all, who better to hire an assassin than the person sitting across the table from the target? No, the only real solution was to warn the commander directly. The problem was that Elena had no way to speak to him without alerting Marcus to her intentions. Any approach to the table would be observed, and any whispered warning would be overheard by beings with hearing far superior to humans. The Draconari could detect sounds that human ears could not even register. She needed another way to communicate. Elena returned to the service station and pretended to organize the dessert menus while she considered her options. The commander would never accept a note passed openly, and even if he did, Marcus would see the exchange and react immediately. She needed to be subtle. She needed to be clever. She needed to think like the person she used to be before she had walked away from that life and tried to become someone ordinary. The answer came to her as she picked up a fresh stack of cloth napkins. The Draconari had many advantages over humans, including size and strength and scales that could stop most weapons, but they also had one significant weakness that most species overlooked. Their culture considered written communication to be primitive and beneath them. Important matters were always spoken aloud in the Draconari. Tradition, because spoken words carried weight and honor, while written words were seen as the tools of liars and cowards. This meant that most Draconari never learned to read the written languages of other species. Why would they bother when they considered such languages to be worthless? But Commander Varathkex was not most Draconari. Elena had spent 8 months observing the powerful beings who dined at this restaurant, and she had learned many things that she probably should not know. She knew that the commander had risen to power not through brute strength but through intelligence and adaptability. She knew that he spoke 17 languages fluently, including 3 human dialects, and she knew that he could read human writing because she had once seen him studying a document written in English when he thought no one was watching. The Draconari vision was far superior to human vision. They could see details at distances that would appear as blur to human eyes. If Elena could write a message small enough that Marcus would not notice it, but large enough that the commander could read it, she might be able to warn him without alerting the assassin. She selected a white cloth napkin from the stack and retrieved a needle and thread from the small sewing kit that all servers carried for emergency uniform repairs. Her hands moved quickly and precisely as she embroidered tiny letters into the fabric. The thread was the same shade of white as the napkin, which meant that a human looking at it would see nothing unusual. But Draconari eyes could detect subtle variations in color that humans could not perceive. To Commander Varathkex, the message would stand out like fire against snow. Elena finished her work and examined the napkin carefully. The words were barely visible even to her enhanced vision, and she knew exactly where to look. Listen, pretend waiter on left side. It was not elegant, and it was not detailed, but it was enough. If the commander understood the message, he would know what to do. If he did not understand, then Elena would have to find another way to stop the assassination. She folded the napkin and placed it on her serving tray alongside the dessert menus across the room. Marcus was still standing near the decorative pillar, pretending to be busy with nothing while his eyes tracked the commander's every movement. The assassin was waiting for the perfect moment. Elena needed to reach the table before that moment arrived. She walked toward the corner with measured steps, forcing herself to maintain the calm and unhurried pace that was expected of servers in fine establishments. Running would attract attention. Showing fear would alert Marcus that something was wrong. She had to be invisible. She had to be just another piece of furniture in a room full of expensive decorations. Commander Varathkex and Ambassador Trovax were still deep in conversation when Elena approached their table. The commander was speaking in low tones about shipping routes, and the ambassador was nodding in a way that suggested he was planning to betray every promise he made tonight. Elena bowed low and began to recite the dessert options in a voice that was steady and professional. As she spoke, she placed the napkin directly in front of the commander, pressing it into his massive clawed and with a touch that lingered just a fraction of a second too long. The commander's amber eyes narrowed a bit. Human touching him was a violation of protocol that should have resulted in immediate punishment. His nostrils flared and his tail twitched in a way that suggested anger, but then he looked down at the napkin and Elena saw something change in his expression. He did not react outwardly. He did not gasp or stiffen or give any sign that he had received information that could save his life. Instead, he laughed at something Ambassador Trilvex said and shifted his massive body in his chair, angling himself away from the decorative pillar where Marcus stood. Elena felt a wave of relief wash through her. He understood the commander had read her message, and he understood. She retreated from the table with another bow and returned to her position near the service station. Now she just had to wait and hope that the commander knew what to do with the warning she had given him. The clock on the wall showed 21:43 station time. Elena estimated that Marcus would make his move within the next 5 minutes. Whatever happened next, she had done everything she could. The rest was up to the dragon. Commander Vorathkex had survived 17 assassination attempts in his 200 years of life. The first had come when he was barely more than a hatchling, and his uncle had tried to poison his food in order to eliminate a rival for the family. Thronavorath X had survived because a servant had tasted the food first and died screaming on the dining room floor. That lesson had stayed with him for the rest of his life. Trust. No one watch everything and never assume that you are safe simply because you are powerful. The human waitress had violated every protocol when she touched his hand, and for a moment Vorathkex had considered having her removed from the restaurant in chains. Then he had looked at the napkin. His eyes could see things that human eyes could never perceive, and the message embroidered into the white fabric had burned itself into his mind. Liasti and Piarita armed left side EC had not reacted because reaction meant death. An assassin who knew he had been discovered would strike immediately before his target could prepare. So Vorathkex had laughed and shifted his position and pretended that nothing was wrong while his ancient warrior instincts screamed warnings inside his skull. The left side he let his gaze drift casually across the dining room until it settled on the new waiter standing near the decorative pillar. The man appeared unremarkable at first glance, with a professional smile and a crisp uniform that matched the other servers, but Vorathkex had not survived 17 assassination attempts by accepting first glances. He studied the way the man stood with his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, ready for quick movement. He noticed the slight stiffness in the left arm that suggested something hidden beneath the jacket, and he recognized the look in the man's eyes. That was the look of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Vorathkex had seen that look in the mirror many times. Ambassador Trilvex was still talking about trade agreements and territorial boundaries, and all the other meaningless words that diplomats used to fill time. Before betraying each other, Vorathkex wondered if Trilvex had hired the assassin or if this was the work of some third party trying to destabilize both factions. It did not matter at the moment. What mattered was survival. The commander considered his options while maintaining the appearance of casual attention to the conversation. His personal guards were stationed outside the dining room because diplomatic protocol required both parties to leave their weapons and security personnel at the door. This had seemed reasonable when the agreement was made. Now it seemed like a fatal error. The assassin would not use a conventional weapon because conventional weapons could not penetrate Draconari scales. That meant he was carrying something exotic, something designed specifically for killing beings like Vorathkex. Most likely choice was a Korean phase pistol. Those weapons fired concentrated energy that could burn through even the thickest scales at close range. They were illegal in most of the galaxy, but easily available if you knew where to look and had enough credits. If the assassin was carrying such a weapon, then Vorathkex needed to ensure that the first shot missed. Once the assassin revealed himself, there would be chaos and noise and screaming guests and in that confusion, Varathkex could close the distance and use his natural weapons to eliminate the threat. Draconary did not need guns. They had claws and teeth and 200 years of combat experience, but first he needed to survive that first shot. Varathkex shifted his chair again, moving his vulnerable neck ridge further away from the assassin's line of sight. He also angled his body so that his thicker shoulder scales were facing the threat ambassador. Trilvex frowned at this movement but said nothing. Perhaps he assumed that Varathkex was simply uncomfortable in the human-designed furniture, or perhaps he knew exactly what was happening and was waiting to see how it played out. The clock on the wall showed 21:45 station time. Varathkex estimated that the assassin would strike soon. Longer the man waited, the greater the chance that something would go wrong. Professional killers understood this, which is why they always chose their moment carefully and then acted without hesitation. The human waitress had returned to her position near the service station, and she was watching the assassin with eyes that seemed far too alert for a simple server. Varathkex found himself wondering about her. Who was she really? How had she known what the assassin was planning? And why had she risked herself to warn a Draconary commander who had specifically requested that no humans be allowed near him? These questions would have to wait. The assassin was moving. The man had picked up a serving tray and was walking toward the corner table with the casual confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he was. To anyone watching, he appeared to be just another waiter approaching to check on the VIP guests, but Varathkex could see the slight tremor in his hands and the tension in his shoulders, and the way his eyes were locked on the target. The moment was coming. Varathkex let his claws extend slightly beneath the table where no one could see them. His muscles coiled like springs, preparing for explosive movement. His heart began to beat faster, pumping blood to his limbs and sharpening his senses. Assassin was 10 meters away, then 5, then 3. His right hand reached inside his jacket. Varathkex prepared to throw himself to the side and then launch himself at the threat, but before either of them could move, the human waitress appeared behind the assassin like a ghost, materializing from shadow. She was carrying a serving tray, and she was smiling politely as if she was simply trying to get past him to reach another table. The assassin ignored her because she was just a human, and humans were not threats. This was his final mistake. The serving tray came up in a blur of motion that was far too fast and far too precise for a simple waitress. The first strike caught the assassin's weapon arm at the elbow, and the gun that was halfway out of his jacket fell from nerveless fingers. The second strike connected with his temple and produced a sound like a ripe fruit being crushed. The assassin collapsed to the marble floor without making a sound. The entire attack had taken less than 2 seconds. The dining room erupted into chaos as the other guests realized what had happened. Someone screamed, and tables were overturned, and expensive dishes shattered on the floor. Ambassador Trilvex was making loud protests of innocence, even though no one had accused him of anything yet. The security guards burst through the entrance with weapons drawn, and their shouts added to the fuzz. Confusion. Varathkex rose slowly from his chair and looked down at the unconscious assassin and then up at the human waitress who had just saved his life. She met his gaze for a single moment, and in that moment, he saw something that surprised him. There was no fear in her eyes. There was no pride or expectation of reward. There was only the calm satisfaction of someone who had completed a job that needed to be done. Then she was gone. She slipped through the kitchen doors before anyone could stop her, and by the time Varathkex thought to send someone after her, she had vanished completely. The security team was securing the assassin and ambassador. Trilvex was demanding to know what was happening, and the restaurant manager was having what appeared to be a complete mental breakdown. But Varathkex just stood there staring at the kitchen doors and wondering who that woman really was. He looked down at the napkin still clutched in his clawed hand. Embroidered message was barely visible, but he could still read it perfectly, cacophically. Human had saved his life tonight. a human had seen what his own intelligence network had missed. A human had acted without hesitation and without expectation of reward, and then she had disappeared like smoke in the windworth. Had a feeling that he would be thinking about this night for a very long time. Elena moved through the lower levels of Nexus Station with the ease of someone who had memorized every corridor and every shortcut and every hidden passage over the past 8 months. She had discarded her server uniform in a waste recycling unit 3 levels up and was now wearing the plain gray coveralls of a maintenance worker. Her identification badge showed a different name and a different face, and anyone who stopped her would find nothing suspicious. This was not the first time Elena had disappeared after completing a mission. It probably would not be the last. The lower levels of the station were a maze of pipes and wires and machinery that kept the massive structure functioning. Few people came down here unless they had specific business, and the shadows were deep enough to hide almost anything. Elena found a quiet alcove behind a water recycling unit and allowed herself to breathe. Her hands were shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off, and she could feel the familiar crash that always followed intense action. She had not planned to get involved tonight. She had spent 12 years building a new identity and a new life, and she had sworn to herself that she would never go back to being the person she used to be. But then she had seen the assassin, and she had recognized the threat, and she had known with absolute certainty that if she did nothing, an innocent being would die. Well, perhaps not innocent. Commander Vorath Kex had almost certainly killed millions of people during his rise to power, and his hands were stained with enough blood to fill an ocean. But he was not guilty of whatever crime had prompted tonight's assassination attempt, and Elena could not stand by and watch someone be murdered when she had the power to prevent it. This was her curse. This was the thing that had driven her out of the intelligence service and onto the run. She could not ignore suffering when she saw it. She could not walk away from injustice. Even when walking away was the smart thing to do, her former handlers had called it a weakness. Elena called it being human. She pulled a small communication device from her pocket and checked for any alerts or warnings that might indicate she had been identified. The station's security network was buzzing with activity, but none of it was directed at her. The assassin had been taken into custody and was being interrogated somewhere in the security complex. Ambassador Trovex had been detained for questioning after the weapon found on the assassin was traced to a manufacturer with known connections to the Scaled Dominion. Faction Commander Vorathkex had returned to his ship with his personal guards and was reportedly demanding a full investigation. No one was looking for a human waitress who had vanished into the kitchen. Elena allowed herself a small smile. She had gotten away clean, which meant she could return to her normal life tomorrow and pretend that none of this had ever happened. But even as she thought this, she knew it was not entirely true. The commander had seen her face. He had looked directly at her with those ancient amber eyes, and she had seen recognition in his gaze. Not recognition of her identity, but recognition of what she was. He knew that she was not just a simple server. He knew that she had training and skills that did not belong in a restaurant. And if he was as intelligent as his reputation suggested, he would try to find her. Elena considered her options. She could leave the station tonight and disappear to another world, where no one would ever find her. She had done this before, and she could do it again. But she was tired of running. She was tired of building new identities and new lives, only to abandon them when things became complicated. She had found something like peace here on Nexus Station. She had friends and a small apartment and a job that paid enough to live comfortably without requiring her to hurt anyone. She did not want to give that up, so she would stay. She would return to work tomorrow and serve wine to wealthy aliens and pretend that she had never been anyone other than Elena Vasquez, the unremarkable human waitress. If Commander Vorathkex came looking for her, she would deal with that. When it happened, Elena put away her communication device and began walking toward the access ladder that would take her up to the residential levels. The station was quiet at this hour, with most of the population asleep or engaged in the nighttime activities that kept the entertainment district running. She passed a few maintenance workers and a couple of security officers on patrol, but no one gave her a second glance. She was invisible again. Just another human among thousands on a station that housed millions of beings from across the galaxy. When she reached her apartment, she locked the door behind her and stood in the darkness for a long moment, just breathing the familiar smell of her small home surrounding her, the scent of the herbs she grew in her window garden and the old books she collected from the station's antique shops, and the faint chemical tang of the air recyclers that kept everyone alive in the vacuum of space. This was her life now. This was who she had chosen to be. Elena walked to her window and looked out at the stars. The Draconari dreadnought was visible in the distance, a massive shape, bristling with weapons and power. Commander Vorathkex was on that ship right now, probably wondering about the human woman who had saved his life. She wondered what he would do with that wonder. Would he be grateful? Would he be suspicious? Would he try to find her and demand answers? Elena did not know, and she told herself that she did not care. She had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. She turned away from the window and began preparing for sleep. Tomorrow would be another day of serving wine and clearing plates and being invisible. Tomorrow she would be Elena Vasquez again, and tonight would fade into memory like all the other nights when she had been someone else. But as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Elena could not shake the feeling that something had changed. The way the commander had looked at her in that single moment before she disappeared. There had been something in his eyes that she had not expected to see. Respect. Not gratitude or suspicion, but genuine respect from a being who had probably never considered humans worthy of such consideration. Elena did not know what to do with that. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but the image of those amber eyes stayed with her long into the night. Somewhere out there among the stars, a dragon was thinking about her, and Elena was not entirely sure how she felt about that. 3 days had passed since the assassination attempt, and Commander Vorathkex sat alone in his private quarters aboard the dreadnought Crimson Ascendant. The room was designed for Draconari comfort, with heated floors and walls made from stone imported from the homeworld, and lighting that mimicked the red sun of his birth. But Vorathkex was not thinking about comfort. Was thinking about a human waitress who had vanished like smoke after saving his life. The dossier on his desk had cost him a considerable amount of resources to obtain. His intelligence network had worked without rest for 3 days, tracking down every scrap of information about the woman who had been serving wine at the Gilded Nebula. What they had found was both impressive and troubling. Elena Vasquez, born 37 years ago in a place called New Manila on the human homeworld of Earth. Her early life had been unremarkable by human standards, with education and family and all the normal experiences that shaped young beings into adults. But at age 20, she had been recruited by an organization called the Terran Directorate Special Branch. This was where things became interesting. The Special Branch was the most secretive intelligence agency in human space. Its operatives were trained in skills that most humans would never even hear about: infiltration, assassination, sabotage, psychological manipulation. They were the ghosts that protected human interests across the galaxy, and they answered to no one except the highest levels of the Terran government. Elena Vasquez had been one of their best. Her file contained a list of operations that would have been impressive for an agent. Twice her age, she had infiltrated criminal organizations and corporate headquarters, and even the palace of a planetary governor who had been planning to secede from the Terran confederations. She had completed every mission she was assigned, and she had never been captured or identified. Then 12 years ago, she had died, or at least that was what her official record stated. Elena Vasquez had been killed during an operation on a world called Kerensky IV, and her body had never been recovered. The Special Branch had held a memorial service, and her name had been added to the wall of fallen agents, and everyone had moved on except Elena Vasquez was not dead. She was working as a waitress on Nexus Station and saving the lives of Draconari, warlords who had specifically requested that no humans be allowed near. Then Varathkas closed the dossier and stared at the wall of his quarters. He had sent agents to find her, of course. They had tracked her to a small apartment in the residential district, and they had watched her go about her daily life as if nothing unusual had happened. She went to work, and she served wine, and she came home, and she slept. She visited the station's library and the botanical gardens and a small restaurant that served food from her homeworld. She had friends among the station's human population, but she did not seem particularly close to any of them. She was living the life of an ordinary person in the most ordinary way possible, and yet she had recognized an assassin in less than 30 seconds, and she had neutralized him with a serving tray before anyone else even knew there was a threat. Varathkas had offered her rewards through intermediaries. He had offered credits enough to buy a small moon, had offered citizenship in his territory, which would have given her the protection of the most powerful Draconari faction in the sector. He had offered a position in his personal guard, which was an honor that had never been extended to a non-Draconari. In the history of his family, she had refused everything. The messenger who delivered the final offer had reported her exact words: "I was just doing my job." Varathkas did not understand this. He had lived for 200 years, and in that time, he had learned that every being in the galaxy wanted something: power or wealth, or safety or revenge or simple pleasure. Everyone had a price, and everyone could be bought or threatened or manipulated. But this human woman wanted nothing. She had saved his life and asked for nothing in return, and then she had gone back to serving wine as if the whole thing had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience in her day. This was not how the galaxy worked. This was not how anyone worked. And yet here was the evidence sitting on his desk in the form of a dossier that told the story of a woman who had walked away from power and fame and wealth in order to live a quiet life. As Nobodiverthans rose from his chair and walked to the viewport that looked out over the stars. The Kepler Treaty had been signed 2 days ago. Ambassador Trilvex had been released after the investigation, determined that he had not been directly involved in the assassination plot. The assassin himself had been hired by a third party, a rival faction that had hoped to destabilize both sides and seize power in the chaos. That faction was now being systematically destroyed by the combined forces of Varathkas and Trilvex. In a rare moment of cooperation, everything had worked out exactly as it should have, and yet Varathkas could not stop thinking about the human. He had spent his entire life underestimating the young species. They were soft and fragile, and their lives were so short that a Draconari could barely learn their names before they died of old age. They had no claws and no scales and no natural weapons of any kind. By all logic, they should have been prey for the older and more powerful species of the galaxy. But they were not prey. They were something else entirely. They were watchers. They paid attention when everyone else was distracted. And they saw things that others missed. And they acted when action was needed, not for reward or recognition, but simply because they could not stand by and do nothing. Varathkas had called this a weakness when he first encountered humans. Now he was not so sure. Perhaps it was not weakness, but something else entirely. Perhaps it was the very thing that made humans dangerous in ways that other species could not understand. He turned away from the viewport and returned to his desk. The dossier was still there, waiting for a decision. He could order his agents to bring the woman to him, could force her to explain herself and to accept the rewards she had refused. He was powerful enough to do whatever he wanted, and no one would stop him. But he did not do this. Instead, he picked up his personal log and began to record a new entry. Do not underestimate the humans. They are watching. They are always watching, and they will act when you least expect it, not for their own benefit, but simply because They cannot do otherwise. This makes them unpredictable. This makes them dangerous, and this makes them the most valuable allies a wise being could ever hope to. Finvarks ended the recording and sat back in his chair somewhere on Nexus Station. A human woman was pouring wine for ungrateful guests who would never know that their server had once been one of the most skilled operatives in human space. She would continue to live her quiet life, and she would continue to watch, and she would continue to act when action was needed, and Varavkax would remember her, would remember the napkin and the message, and the way she had moved like water and shadow to save his life. He would remember that humans were not the weak and insignificant species that the galaxy believed them to be. They were something far more interesting. They were something that deserved respect. Commander Varavkax looked out at the stars one more time and smiled. It was not a comforting smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just discovered that there was another predator in the jungle, and for the first time in 200 years. Varavkax felt something that surprised him. He felt hope for the future of the galaxy, because if there were more humans like Elena Vasquez out there watching and waiting and ready to act, then perhaps the universe was in better hands than he had ever imagined. The dragon closed his eyes and began to plan for a future where humans were not servants or enemies, but partners. It was a strange thought for a Draconari warlord, but then again, these were strange times, and humans had a way of making everything strange.